It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Derek Beres. Derek is a multifaceted author and media expert based in Portland. He is a staff writer at Freethink Media and co-host of the ConSpirituality podcast. He is the co-author of ConSpirituality, How New Age Conspiracy Theories Become a Public Health Threat. And it's published through Public Affairs Random House Canada in June of 2023, so it's coming out this year. And is currently writing a book on male body dysmorphia. Derek's work has been featured in the New York Times, LA Times, Harper's Bazaar, and Rolling Stone, as well on Good Morning America, The Daily Show, and PBS NewsHour. Please join me in welcoming Derek to the stage.
Thank you, Star, and thank you, Kim, for inviting me to this conference. So I'm here to talk a bit about misinformation. It's been something that I've thought about for a long time, but specifically for the last 3 years since the pandemic began, and a lot of my work has revolved around that. When I was first asked to come to this conference, I started thinking about the ways that libraries are involved in conspiracy theories. Now, growing up, that's something that I wouldn't have thought about that would even be possible. But we have a lot of historical precedent for that. Libraries are places where knowledge is historically gathered. And when you have conflicting interests in societies trying to gain knowledge or push forward certain types of knowledge, and limit other types of knowledge, it makes sense that we would run into this issue. So I think about even closer to this era, Harper Lee in the 1950s with To Kill a Mockingbird had faced banning from libraries. Interestingly, in her case, she was first pushed back against from the right and then later against from the left. And it all kind of coalesced in this place, that all the institutions that all of you work in. Charles Bukowski as well, but that was in the Netherlands. Kurt Vonnegut. There's a long list of people. I kind of didn't think it would happen around Drag Queen Story Hour, but that has been the place where we are now confronted with as we continue to try to battle misinformation and disinformation. Now, I want to look at these two topics through the lens of wellness, which is my specific specialty and area of study for the last 2 decades of my life. And let's just define a term first. Misinformation is, I think, the most prevalent because we get information from a variety of sources and then it's spread through these networks that we've never had to deal with before as a species, right, through social media and different information networks. Disinformation is the willful spreading of that information because of an agenda. So there's a smaller amount of people spreading disinformation, but then the misinformation spreads through these much larger networks because people don't have the resources or understand how to find good information. And in this talk, like many of you, like all of you, I have my own political leanings, but that's not really the focus because that is the challenge that we face. It reminds me of growing up in the library system with the Dewey Decimal System, with card catalogs when I couldn't just type something in on my phone, going through, writing papers, and having to look through a variety of sources to be able to present an argument. And that doesn't exist as much any longer, at least not in the public. And that's a real shame. So what I want to do is I want to look at some examples of misinformation in the wellness industry. I want to look at how they spread throughout these networks and what the incentives are for their spread. And then I want to offer what 3 years of the podcast has brought me to be not solutions. I don't think there is one answer to most anything, but especially this problem. But at least some things that we can do to help combat the spread of misinformation. And then maybe by the end, we'll have collectively solved the world. Sound good? Yeah, we can do this. I need a little more buy-in back here. This is your job. I need your help. So I want to start with a video, and it's the only one we'll watch today, but we'll enter here. Do I need to hit play again? Okay.
To know, Liver King says, why would you eat a vegetable when you can eat a testicle? Well, here's the answer.
You guys know vegetables like this chard are bullshit. They are full of defense chemicals. This is full of isothiocyanates that are going to inhibit iodine absorption at the level of your thyroid. That is garbage. Get that out of there. We got some spinach over there full of oxalates. Vegetables, least sought after foods by humans throughout our existence. Focus on animal meat and organs if you want to thrive. Leave the vegetables for the cows.
Liver King, out.
There are probably thousands of videos I could have chosen. I wanted something a little more humorous because most of it is so depressing, what I research and deal with on a regular basis. But you might be wondering, as I was when I saw this, why are two grown men yelling at vegetables in a supermarket aisle? Why do they have problems with spinach? Why is one of them shirtless, right? So the Liver King, the shirtless guy, he is both a character and a caricature. So the character is named Brian Johnson, and he's a marketing expert. He comes from the world of marketing. And at some point in his career, he decided, I am going to take on this caricature of this brawny meathead who only eats raw meat and goes out and sells it to the public. There's a video that came out a few months before this one where he's at his table with organs and a knife and eating it and just talking for an hour as he eats. There's videos with his children where they're sticking their heads in organs. Joe Rogan had once boosted him by saying that there's no way that this man could not be doing steroids. And Brian swore that no, it was his all-meat diet and his workout regimen that gave him this body. He does $16,000 a month of steroids. So that came out because some leaked emails happened, right? But here's the thing. He turned his caricature into a sales vehicle. So with the other man, who I'll get to in a moment in that video, they have a company called Ancestral Supplements. They did $100 million in business last year alone. And their business is taking organs like testicles and liver and stomach and tripe, and then making them into powdered form so that people can just take them as capsules. Now the problem is, and this is what we broker in so much in the wellness industry, is he gives a promise, an aspirational promise. If you do this the way that I do it, then you follow these steps, then you will have the life that I have. Now he is a millionaire many times over, and that is not possible for most people, but we are drawn to the aspiration of what he's offering. And so he is using the willful spreading of disinformation, the idea that only eating raw animals is the best health practice that you can partake in, to then create a misinformation pipeline. Within a couple of months of joining Instagram and creating a few of these videos, he had 1.7 million followers. Now, when Joe Rogan called him out, he's a very good marketer. He used that to his advantage and gained hundreds of thousands of more followers because the most popular podcaster in the world, who is also known for spreading misinformation, was able to say his name on his platform, and he turned that into a marketing opportunity. Now, most of the people that we deal with in wellness do not have those opportunities, but the general network with which they move through is the same. So that brings us to his partner, whose name is Paul Saladino. Paul Saladino is also has a vested interest in making you think that eating meat is the best possible thing for you. And he is the author of The Carnivore Code, which basically is a book that spreads that idea. He also has an MD after his name. And you're going to notice this a lot with wellness influencers, that they use a certain level of credential to then pretend to be experts in other fields. I see this often with chiropractors, where they become neuroscientists or physicists, but they are chiropractors. And I have nothing wrong with chiropractic. I've gone to hundreds of sessions in my life. But there's something about certain ways of getting a doctorate, and that seems to be one that we've identified over and over, where they will willfully spread misinformation. And again, not all of them by any means. Paul is a psychiatrist, but he's acting as a nutritionist. And that, again, is a real problem in the sense that using adjacent knowledge to another field, right? I mean, how many people did you see online who became epidemiologists when the pandemic started, right? Just massive, massive. I mean, how many people became gender identity specialists when transgender people started to become more known to the mainstream, right? So people, a little bit of knowledge is really dangerous, right? And again, you know this because you deal with a lot of knowledge all the time and everything is nuanced. And that's the biggest battle that we have at the podcast and with all of the guests that we have, who are usually cardiologists and psychiatrists and psychologists and epidemiologists. We talk to a lot of different specialists in their field. Specialists, they stay confined to what they know, and if they are going to talk outside their field, they let you know before doing it. That is not what happens in these social media networks where all this misinformation is spread. So this is just one example of this idea of diet. Diet happens to be a big one. Star had mentioned I'm working on male body dysmorphia right now. I had suffered from orthorexia for 15 years. I grew up overweight. I had a lot of issues around my weight that I had to deal with for a very long time. And having it happen to me and then knowing so many people through the podcast and also having worked as a yoga and fitness instructor for 17 years, so many people are very vulnerable around their bodies and how it looks. And people will take advantage of that to try to sell you on their products and services. That is my specialty on the podcast, and it's I think one of the most egregious practices is taking advantage of people's vulnerability. Now, just to give you an overview of some of the other types of misinformation, there seems to be a romanticization around the 19th century that's happening in wellness spaces right now. The 19th century was extremely important. You had the codification of vaccine science, right? So vaccines date back well over 1,000 years. The first known literature on vaccines comes from the Chinese textbooks, which said that if you were bit by a dog and contracted rabies, if you take a little bit of that dog's brain and rub it on the wound, it will heal it. Now, I wouldn't advise that, but it does show that there was this idea that was going on for a very long time that if you took the thing that hurt you in a minute dose and applied it to the wound, it could heal you. Vaccine science, of course, was codified by Edward Jenner in the middle of the 19th century with smallpox, and then later with Edward Koch and the anthrax bacterium. Now, we also have hand washing, which was a very important evolution in our biological understanding. You had Dr. Semmelweis in Hungary, who said, hey, these doctors keep going from the morgue straight to deliver babies, and the babies keep dying. Maybe there's a problem with that. How about they wash their hands before they do that? And when he tested that in hospitals, it worked really well. And for realizing that, he was driven out of the profession. He went mentally insane and died impoverished. And then a few years after his death, people said, oh, maybe he was right. And you have, of course, antibiotics, which were coming about at that time, and then germ theory, which is the idea that you can see diseases under the microscope. Now, we couldn't know that for a long time because we didn't have the technology. So technology advances are scientific understanding advances. So all of these things happened in the golden age of science, which is considered 1850s, 1900 era. In our circle, we're noticing a real pushback on all of these ideas. So instead of germ theory, there is something called terrain theory. Now, germ theory was credited to John Snow, who realized that cholera was transmitted through the water at the Broad Street pump in London because he was able to look at the maps and realize where the outbreaks were. Again, he was laughed out because the government didn't want to update all the pumps at that time. But then later, Louis Pasteur, who you might know through pasteurization, the term, kind of codified germ theory and our understanding of it, and Edward Koch's work as well. At the time, there was a man named Antoine Béchamp who had a different idea. He believed, and this is kind of taking off the concept of miasma theory. So during the Black Plague, there was the idea that bad vapors in the air would come down and infect you, and that's how you got sick. So Béchamp took that idea, and he said, it's the environment that makes you sick. Viruses itself will not make you sick. If you have unhealthy tissues, then the virus can penetrate and you will become sick. Now, that is a really important point because that eventually leads to things like the law of attraction and The Secret. This idea that if you're not healthy, it's your fault that you get sick, right? This idea has persisted for a long time. So the idea has been revived by people like Zach Bush is a well-known doctor who is brokering in that misinformation right now, that unhealthy tissues. He will say there are billions of viruses out there, so why should we worry about one or two of them? And this was during the time of COVID. It just so happens that one or two of them could be very deadly to us, but he overlooks that fact. There's the idea of not taking any pharmaceutical products in favor of homeopathy. Homeopathy is a particular pet peeve of mine. There is nothing in those bottles. Literally, that's the whole point, right? So Samuel Hahnemann rightfully thought that there was a lot of barbaric practices in the early 19th century, like bloodletting. He didn't agree with that. So he said, he actually, and this is interesting because a lot of homeopathists today will say it will be anti-vax. He was a big fan of vaccines because vaccines work on the idea that a little bit cures a lot of the same substance. So homeopathy operates under the idea that like cures like. Only he made it the essence of the like cures like. So he created a process called potentization, which is a distillation process of active ingredients. I always pronounce this wrong, and I practice and always forget it, but you've probably seen that flu drug, oxacillin. My wife can probably pronounce it because she lived in France. So it's the biggest drug in France. It makes $20 million in America, and it starts with taking duck liver and heart and distilling it down 200 times. A physician named Harriet Hall, who passed last year, she figured out that in order to find one molecule of the duck in the product itself, you would need a container 30 times the size of the Earth. It is sugar, it is water. That is all that is in those pills. It makes $20 million in America. When someone asked someone at Boron, which is the manufacturer of the drug, is this drug safe? She replied, of course it's safe, there's nothing in it. So homeopathy in favor of any pharmaceutical intervention is something that has come up a lot. One that really scares me is the idea of getting off of SSRIs and benzodiazepines to do meditation or breath work, right? And I want to flag, and I'll get to this in a little bit, I have problems with our for-profit healthcare system. I think the system we live in is horrible in a lot of ways. And I really respect and honor all of the researchers and doctors and nurses who are doing the best work with it. So I don't want to seem like I'm like anti or completely for. And I know that SSRIs and benzodiazepines don't have tapering protocols, and a lot of people struggle with that if it's not working for them. But the idea of not listening to your psychiatrist, but listening to someone you follow on Instagram is unfortunately something we've seen a lot of in ConSpirituality. In fact, we have a segment called Listener Stories where listeners will come on and we interview them, and they tell us stories just such as this. There's the idea that you can take supplements instead of vaccinations to battle COVID, which is, of course, nonsense. There is a saying, cancer is an energetic problem. And if you get cancer, that's because your energy wasn't right. As a cancer survivor, I take a lot of issue with that, but you will see that in these spaces often. There is an anti-hand washing movement right now. There's an anti-sunscreen movement. I'm working on an episode that's coming about 3 or 4 weeks on this in particular. And when I announced that I was working on that, a disinformation researcher at the ADL reached out to me and said, hey, I've been doing research on this all last year. And it turns out the anti-sunscreen movement is rooted in anti-Semitism, which is phenomenal. Every time we come across any of these ideas, it always goes back to anti-Semitism. I don't understand. Is it just too easy? I don't know, but that is a phenomenon. And there's something called German New Medicine, which is rooted in eugenics. Riek Hammer, the guy who created it, thought that chemotherapy was an initiative to destroy Western civilization, and it was started by the Jews. So again, we're finding this over and over again. So what you'll see these influencers and these naturopaths and homeopathists and different figures say over and over again is this system, the incentives in the system are really bad, the Western medical system. And again, I agree with parts of that. But then they will say, never do anything involved in this. Buy my product or service over here instead. And that is what is known as the alternative medicine space. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes. It's from a vaccine maker and a pediatrician, Paul. Oh, that's Paul. I skipped that. From Paul Offit. And there's no such thing as alternative medicine. There's only medicine that works and medicine that doesn't. If there's an herb that is efficacious for something, awesome. Then it's medicine. It works. If there's something that a pharmaceutical company creates that doesn't work, it's not medicine. It's not a black and white in that term. There's a lot because some drugs, as we know, will work for some people. We don't know. We've advanced greatly in our scientific understanding, but we're still learning as we go along. And I think that's always really important to point out. Conspiritualists are deeply suspicious of any power structure. And so that will then translate into anything that is being offered by quote unquote Western medicine. The term that you'll often see is called allopathic. Allopathy was created by Samuel Hahnemann, the inventor of homeopathy. Now, there's a sort of evolution of that word that's happened. He originally meant, so if homeopathy is like cures like, allopathy is opposite cures like. So in an allopathic system, if you have diarrhea, you will take something to stop the diarrhea. In homeopathy, if you have diarrhea, you want more diarrhea so that you will take something to get more of it, which we know is the wrong way to go in general, considering you can literally die with too much diarrhea if you don't get those fluids back into your body. But since it's only the essence of the ingredient, I wouldn't worry about it too much. So this all led to what 3 years ago I had written an article, and this was actually before the pandemic. A philosopher named Jules Evans in the UK had dug up a 2011 research paper by two academics, Charlotte Ward and David Voas. And Ward had coined the term conspirituality. And it is this synthesis of the female-dominated New Age with the male-dominated political right-wing leaning side of things. It is not a new phenomenon. In our book that's coming out in June 13th, if you want it in your library, that's the only marketing pitch I'll do, but we spent a lot of time on this book. I think it's very informative. We have noticed that it's been going on in America for at least 200 years. And in political theory, it's called horseshoe theory, right? It's the idea that if you're on the left and you go so far to the left, you eventually meet with the right. That's a debated political theory. It came up after World War II. I don't want to get into the specifics on that, but I do think it holds some truth. Another thing that happens is we've reviewed hundreds of people in this space. We've never seen an instance of anyone start to move to the left. So we see a lot of people who are liberals start to move right in their philosophy over and over again. That's why you'll see Russell Brand going on to Tucker Carlson's show. Somebody who is considered a very liberal political thinker recently said, not kidding, this week, that Tucker has never spread misinformation. He's a really stand-up guy, so you should believe him. So we see that left to right movement very often. Now, conspirituality, there's 3 pillars of conspirituality. The first is nothing is as it seems. It's this idea that there's this sort of mystical undercurrent underneath everything. Now, when you get to health and sciences, it's this idea that there is a disembodied origin of consciousness, right? That there's something, it's a very religious ideology. There's something underneath everything that is moving. You can't pinpoint it with anything that we can do to measure biology or physiology. So the idea is everything is sort of a conspiracy. Nothing is ever what they're telling you. They are usually not defined. Sometimes they are. It's usually George Soros, or Bill Gates. But in general, it's never really well defined. Everything is connected, has a very sort of grandiose idea, this idea that we're all atoms and made of stardust. Fine, yes, we all are built from the same materials, but there's a lot of differentials that we experience along the way. So it's this idea that if this company is doing this one thing over here, they must be in collusion with this organization over here. You see this sort of famous conspiracy theory map, right, where everything's pinpointed. That happens. And there has been research that has shown that if you believe in one conspiracy theory, you tend to believe in others along the downline. And then that there are no accidents, that everything is meant for a purpose. And that goes back to what I was talking about, the law of attraction, right? That is this idea. Some friends of ours, colleagues on a podcast called Decoding the Gurus, just did one on Oprah Winfrey. And she very much believes in this mindset that everything horrible that can possibly happen is a teaching lesson. I want to point out that that's different than experiencing adversity and then making the best of it. There's a big difference. I believe in that. I believe that you can go through really bad things and come out better for it. It's the idea of predestiny that I think is really dangerous in this particular equation. So, I had written the article based off of Joel Evans's work on conspirituality on a company. I work for a company called Freethink. They have a website called Big Think. And then a couple months later, there was a pseudo-documentary you might have heard of called Plandemic. And the week that came out, I contacted Matthew Remski and Julian Walker, my co-hosts, and I said, hey, this is going to be really dangerous. This was in the beginning of the pandemic. The vaccines hadn't been developed, and this film was already talking about the dangers of the coming vaccines, which hadn't even been invented yet. And that was the origins of our podcast. They came onto my podcast. I said, no one is really using this term. It's from an obscure paper that few people know about, so we decided to run with it. Interesting side note, Charlotte Ward, the person, we did this podcast for 2 years. We've been doing 3 years now. The first 2 years, we did not know that the person who wrote it was writing it in favor of conspiracy theories, not as a criticism. And when you go back and reread the paper, you can see that it's written in such a way that you can't really tell where she's coming from. We talked to her. She won't contact us. She emailed us once, and then she dropped off. But her professor, who she was working under, he's been vague, but he did not even know that at the time that she submitted the paper. He just did more editorial oversight on it. So it's pretty fantastic. She lives in the UK and continues to be a lizard people are orchestrating the world government type thinker. And sadly, that is true. So, how did we get here? So, my first published article came out 30 years ago this year when I was at Rutgers University, and I realized I wanted to pursue journalism and writing as a career. And I think about the different ways that media have evolved since that time. When I graduated, I moved to San Francisco in 1997, and I was going to make it as a print journalist. I wanted to be in magazines. And all the work I could get in San Francisco at that time was for this thing called the internet. And I was like, I don't want to write for that. I want to be in print magazines. So I moved back to New Jersey. I got some reporting gigs, and I worked in that for a while. My father's a computer programmer. I grew up with computers. I didn't have the foresight at the time to understand how media was going to evolve at that time. So when I think about the ways that these misinformation networks work and misinformation spreads, there's just too much of it, right? David Carr, the New York Times, wrote a book where he talks about how he couldn't finish a book, and he was a writer, right? I read on average a book a week, and since I've gotten more and more into social media, I mean, the last decade, it's a lot harder sometimes to just sit down and actually finish a book. I have to put my phone away. I have to just really say, I'm going to spend the next hour focused on this and be away from my equipment. When you have this much information coming at you all the time, and considering that something like over 80% of the people don't read the articles, they only read the headlines. When I worked in newspapers in the 1990s, every newspaper had a headline writer, and that was to avoid redundancies in the headline. But now, the headline, that is the most magical part of any story, because it's written in such a way that if the headline can express everything and get you to click on it, they're going to get that advertising revenue because you've clicked on it, but you're not going to read, you're going to scan, you're not going to take in the information. So when you have this much information, it's impossible to process. So we know that the most egregious and seductive headlines are the ones we're going to look at and be like, wow, and then take as gospel. And that's really dangerous. There was a study done where they looked at what happens if something is flagged as misinformation before you read the headline, concurrently with the headline, or after the headline. And by far, people who were flagged before would be more skeptical of what they were about to read. But if you've ingested the headline before you're flagged that it's misinformation, it almost doesn't matter at that point. So that's a really dangerous place to be in if you work in media or you're trying to get across good information. Of course, we all know this. I don't think I would need to spend too much time on it. We look for things that confirm our pre-existing beliefs, and then we look for people who will confirm what we believe. 10% of Twitter users post 80% of the content. And it's only a small percentage of users who are on Twitter, and yet that drives so much of the news cycle outside of Twitter. And that's really dangerous when you have such a small amount of people. I mean, a few weeks ago, how many people are on Twitter? Very few of you, good, okay. There is an unknown person, right-wing Trump MAGA fan called Cat Turd. And Cat Turd did a poll about who should win the next presidency, and Donald Trump won. And then Donald Trump reposted the graphic saying, see, I'm leading in the polls. That happened. That happened. So we have a chapter in our book called Conspiritualists Are Not Wrong. And this is where I'll get back to what I was talking about before. We do not live in a great healthcare system, right? During the first year of the pandemic, I lost most of my work. My wife lost her job. She was in hospitality in a hotel at the time. We had to work on career switches. Thankfully, we had some savings, and I had a really strong following from my yoga community. So I was doing online classes that was able to float for a while as we got things together. We were lucky, but during the first year, I think, we went through like 4 different healthcare providers. I lost my last job in January and had to switch again. The fact that in the last 5 years, we've had 7 or 8 healthcare providers, it's insane, like that we have to go through this. It's really stressful when you're working for somewhere and you're mostly focused on keeping those benefits. So I really do understand when people are disenchanted with the bureaucratic process of what it takes to try to get healthcare in this country. When you start from that place, it makes sense that you will look for alternatives. So a lot of people come from it because of that skepticism of our healthcare system, and I get it. And we do try to have some empathy on the podcast around that because science isn't perfect. I was medically injured when I was 11, and I don't blame the doctor. I think it was something at the time. It was the science at the time, and they didn't know any better. And it's created something in my body that has continued throughout the rest of my life, which comes from breaking my leg a few times and the way that it was healed. And it really sucks, and I get that. But you can also recognize that we don't have silver bullets for all of healthcare. And the last one is the death of expertise. And this is what I was talking about before, where if you're a chiropractor and you're presenting yourself as a neuroscientist, I'm speaking specifically of a man named Joe Dispenza who does this, and he talks about neuroscience all the time when he's not trained in that field. It's really dangerous. It's dangerous because there are actual neuroscientists who are reading what you're talking about and being like, no, 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 no. On that, there's another neuroscientist whose work is fine. His name is Andrew Huberman. He's very popular. But he recently said that molecules from sunscreen have been found in the brain 10 years after application. And I reached out to a chemist in Australia whose specialty is sunscreens, and she was like, what is he talking about? Like, that's impossible. And she gave me all of the reasons. And this is the problem. He said this as an aside on Rhonda Patrick's podcast, and it got spread around, millions of views, and people believe this. But the chemist I talked to spent a week looking at the literature for any sign of this being true and couldn't find it. So when you say something flippantly and then you have an actual expert who dives into the literature, they just can't keep up. There's no possible way to combat that amount of misinformation. Tom Nichols wrote a great book called The Death of Expertise, and this is basically what I was just talking about. A little bit of information is a very dangerous thing. Okay, so I want to get into a little bit more on the medical distrust. When you see headlines like this, and it's true, it's understandable that you would be skeptical that pharmaceutical companies are looking out for you. I've witnessed this for decades. You know, when I was in New York City yoga studios in the 1990s, as practicing and then eventually becoming a teacher in the early 2000s, you would hear things all the time in these spaces. Food is your medicine. You're your own best doctor. You should be able to cure your anxiety and depression naturally. These are not new ideas. I've heard them over and over again. Being that I was a health journalist for a long time, hopefully, to my knowledge, I didn't spread stuff like that very often. At least when it comes to medical stuff, avoiding that is very important. But those are in what we call brick and mortar spaces, right? You're in a small space, 20, 30, 40 people. It can spread from there, but it's usually confined. Now, what happens during a pandemic, I'm in my living room doing YouTube classes. All of my colleagues who are yoga instructors are in the same situation. How do we make money? I have to pay my rent. I have to pay my mortgage. How are we going to do this? Oh, you're going to give me a cut of your supplement if I share it with my 10,000 followers? Okay, that's a way to make some money. That's how the pipeline begins. Supplements are generally benign. One of my colleagues calls it very expensive piss, is basically what you get. Right? Because your body will just release any vitamin or mineral it doesn't need. But not always. Some of them can be dangerous, and there have been deaths with certain supplements, like a belladonna supplement that was used a couple of years ago in Canada, killed a number of infants. So it's bad enough for yogis to spread misinformation like this, but it's even worse when we get to actual doctors. This is Peter McCullough. He was known in these circles as a big proponent of hydroxychloroquine for COVID. And then he went on Joe Rogan's podcast, and that was when his star took off. He said things like, the asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 doesn't exist. People under 50 shouldn't get vaccinated. He said that spike proteins cause cell death. Looked up with some biologists, that's not true. And early on in the pandemic, I came up with a sort of catchphrase that I've used throughout, which is watch what they say and then watch what they sell. So here's a great example. He started something with a investor in Canada called the Wellness Company, where they sell supplements to combat spike proteins. So he tells you, don't get vaccinated, but my dandelion flower supplement is really good for COVID if you get it. They also broker in COVID-19 vaccination detoxes. Not a thing, but they sell them. He is the first member of the chief medical board at the Wellness Company. It was founded by a millionaire called Foster Coulson, who his grandfather made a lot of money in logging and aviation in Canada. And this has become the big grift now. One of them, the detox protocols. Detoxing is there's a parasite detox. We've covered this often on the podcast. We don't have parasites. If you have parasites, you know you need medical attention. But millions of dollars are made selling parasite detoxes. A big one that's come up lately is statins. Statins are one of the safest medications. My dad's been on a statin for like 40 years. My family has genetic high cholesterol. Never had an issue. Most people don't have an issue. It's not a moneymaker for pharmaceutical companies either because it's generic. But there's this push now to say that cholesterol is a myth and to get off statins. A big person on it, one of my favorite characters, Bulletproof Coffee founder Dave Asprey, who will say that cholesterol doesn't exist, but put a stick of butter in your coffee every morning and then buy my supplement, which will help you with your cholesterol. So watch what they say and watch what they sell. So that makes me think about the Conspiritualist playbook. And I think Asprey is one of the most egregious players in this space. There are a number of them, though. Demonize the system. Like everything is against you. Every power structure is against you. And again, I want to get across, this does not mean not to think critically about what your local, state, or federal government is doing. This is not to say don't question your doctor sometimes and to seek other doctors, other professional help. Like all of these things, those are basic. We should know that. We shouldn't just trust. But if everything is a conspiracy, then you're never going to trust anyone. There was a stat that came out last week, and I guess because it's part of my career, it makes me feel good, but it also scares me. 87% of Americans trust podcasters. I don't know. I wouldn't do that. I know someone said that you listen, thank you, to Conspirituality, and if you do and you look at the show notes, we have extensive show notes for every episode. We cite our research. We make corrections when experts come to us and be like, hey, you got this a little wrong, next episode we try to honor that as much as possible. The wellness industry has no oversight. Supplements don't need to be clinically tested. The statements that a lot of these influencers can make are not vetted in any way. So they will demonize the system to sell their products and services. They take on the role of David. Joe Rogan does this all the time. He has way more downloads and viewers of his podcast than the New York Times. But he will constantly say, don't listen to CNN, don't listen to New York Times, don't listen to me, I'm just a fool. 11 million downloads an episode. So he frames himself as the David in order to make people feel like, hey, you're on my side. We're the little guys. We're trying to battle this. It's a very common technique. The big one, we just did an episode, Julian and I, on this called the censorship megaphone. How many people, well, a lot of you are on Twitter, thank you. How many people will say they're being censored? If you can say that, you're not being censored because people are hearing you. They use that to sell their product. They're on every single possible social media chance. They're being like, I'm being censored. Russell Brand is the worst at this. If you don't know who he is, bless you. So if you could do these two things, if you can demonize the system and you can frame yourself as David, I wish this wasn't so simplistic. I really, really do. but it's to sell. It's just marketing 101. Supplements, Substack subscriptions. I did an article on this recently, looking at some of the biggest anti-vaxxers, and with the publicly available data, these are people who are saying they're being censored, they're on Substack, they sell subscriptions, and they make anywhere from from like $50,000 to $250,000 a month in subscriptions by spreading misinformation. So it's a very, it's a very useful tactic for them, but it's very dangerous, it's very dishonest. So last part, leading to the last part, what's the real problem? And I think one of the biggest is, unfortunately, this is what happens. There was a measles outbreak in Los Angeles in 2015, I believe, in the Brentwood area. And in that case, I don't believe any children died. But the anti-vaxxers who've been working since Andrew Wakefield's unqualified and propagandistic claim that vaccines called autism in 1998, it's been disproven so many times, he was going up to Michigan and talking to the Sudanese community, and there was a big outbreak there, and some children died. It's a real problem, because for the last 2 years, we've seen a 1% drop in children going into nursery school with the proper vaccinations. Besides that, one thing we've talked about a bunch is, and we've had some people on to talk about this, they've lost family members. They've lost family members who are literally in the hospital with COVID dying, thinking they were poisoned by the government. And they wouldn't get vaccinated, they wouldn't take the proper medications to help them, and they died. And this is not something, because these are people, these aren't media figures, these aren't influencers, these are just people, and they have family members to do it. You don't learn about this. But then we talk to them, and it's heartbreaking. And it's all because people got caught in these misinformation pipelines. So, as I said earlier, there's not an answer. There's no answer. Everything is nuance. There's many reasons that people get into this, and then there's no one way to get out of it or to correct it. I was on CNN 2 months ago, and they always like to ask that question, how do we fix it? I was like, I don't know. But here's some things we can take and we can learn. Now, I don't know how appropriate all of these are for the library networks. I don't work in them. I don't know how they function as well as, except being a patron all my whole life. But in terms of the bigger problem of what we're dealing with for media misinformation, I used to get into ground wars with people who have an avatar and a fake name on social media. I don't do it anymore. I don't engage. The way that the algorithms work is you're boosting content that is dangerous. So I do believe, and I have engaged in really well-meaning, constructive debates with people on social media. If you don't believe me, I'm here to tell you it is true. It is possible. It's about approach. It's really hard because when you read text on a screen, you're reading in your voice, not their voice. I battle this a lot. My native language is sarcasm. I am from New Jersey. That is the state language. It doesn't translate on a screen if you don't know the person. So I've definitely made mistakes with that before. But I will usually say, I was being sarcastic, whatever. You can have constructive conversations, but for the most part, people are coming at you with agendas, so boosting conversations is not helpful. It only affects your own mental health, I've found. And that comes from sleepless nights where I'm thinking about some guy in his basement who said something that I didn't like, and I'm sitting there like, why am I thinking about this right now? We recently had Jordan Klepper from The Daily Show on the podcast. He's hosting this week. He's awesome. I was on The Daily Show on his segment about a year and a half ago. And when we asked him a similar question, because he's someone who's at all of the rallies, and he told me some stories about actually feeling endangered and having to run and with his crew away from crowds, right? So a lot different than the work that we do. But he said this, and it stuck with me, is cede some ground. And in such a reactionary environment where a lot of people are only listening to talk and they're only waiting for entry points, doing something, being like what I was talking about earlier, hey, yeah, you had this problem with the medical system, so did I. This is what happened to me. It sucks. But like, let's look at this over here instead of focusing too much on that. Like creating those pathways for conversations can be very helpful. And I found that that actually works, and it is a de-escalation technique on social media and in person. I think it can work in certain situations, and I think it's important to try. This, I would say, is very important for your field, right? Just provide the best information. I said earlier about the information from what I experienced earlier in my life about being not treated in the best way that we know now. When I broke my femur, I was laid up for almost a year. Right now, you will be walking within 2 or 3 days because doctors have realized that blood flow is more important than staying static. So I had a whole bunch of health problems. So that's what I'm referencing specifically. At the time, that was the information they had, and it was good information. We know now that there's better information. So provide the best information, provide multiple sources. I recently bought a book. I'm working on a new podcast about, you started with a land acknowledgement. It's about the history of Oregon and being built as a white secessionist state in the 1850s. So I'm working with some people in Portland on this right now. I think it's a pretty fascinating topic that needs to be addressed. And we have to look at a number of different sources when we're looking at these sorts of conversations. So we're trying to get as widespread a view as possible in order to be able to construct an argument that makes sense to people. Now, the last one's kind of cute. And this comes from a cult expert named Stephen Hassan, he was in the Moonies in the 1970s. And he is now one of the leading cult experts. He was on one of our very first episodes. And he said that when he was in the cult, in the Moonies, and he came home after coming out of it, being brought out by family members, he showed up and his neighbors walked over and they brought a plate of cookies. They never talked about it. They left space if he wanted to talk about it, but they just treated him as he was. And he said this is one of the most powerful techniques, is to remind people of who they were before they started sliding down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. Bring up experiences, bring up ideas they had, bring up things they created. Talk to them about who they were, or just be there for them and listen, even if you don't always agree. Now, it's important to point out that these are all things that you can only do one-on-one or in small group situations. I don't see a fix. I've seen so many attempts of trying to fix media, but it's not going to happen. Like, we have to deal with the media systems we have. What's coming with AI is going to be even crazier, because I work with a team in Berlin on a side project about some AI stuff, and get ready. It's happening already, but get ready for an even greater upswell. So my personal feeling is, like, when you think about trying to change systems, it's, in terms of specifically media, it's not going to happen. And I don't say that as something as disempowering. It's just impossible given how accessible media is to everyone at all times right now. But what you can do is help the people closest to you. You can provide the good information. You can bring a cookie. You can be there for them when they return home. And it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't work in every case. You have to pick and choose your battles. But I think it's the best thing that we can do to shield ourselves from all of the misinformation and disinformation that's going on. And if you have someone who's trying to buy some homeopathic products, maybe refer them to one of our podcast episodes. We can help. Make sure people are getting their proper medical treatment, and try to be a good human being. I think that's basic, but it's what I keep coming back to at the end of this. So thank you. There is some time for a Q&A if anyone has any questions or thoughts they'd like to share. I think they're getting a mic. Great. Thank you, Brittany.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you very much for presenting today. So toward the end of your spiel, you had mentioned the rise of AI-generated services. I'm assuming you're referring to ChatGPT, among others?
Yes, that is the entry point, correct.
Right. So you've likely also heard that universities and the like have also accepted generated scripture as assignments, and they've been passing with flying colors and such, yes?
I've heard that there's been some studies on that, and I've heard that the universities are looking for ways to fight against it. I haven't heard that they're accepting it outright, but I can imagine that that's how, like I've heard that they have been identified after they were passed, but I hadn't heard that any university was saying, go ahead, that's fine.
Right, sorry for the miscommunication. With that said, do you have any tactics at this time to combat or further identify ChatGPT generated misinformation online?
No, I do know that there are companies that are working on, for example, being able to identify videos that are created through AI and sort of put a watermark in them. Like some companies that are using that are creating watermarks that can be identified. I don't think that's going to solve the problem when they're shared on social media and someone sees it and doesn't pay attention to that. And I also know that they are looking for ways to create, it's kind of like the idea of a vaccine, like take something and use it to combat it. So they're looking for AI ways to identify AI-generated text.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for recognizing those of us who have lost family members because of these conspiracy theories. It's really, really heartbreaking. Could you speak a little bit on those who are profiting from trauma? For example, Gwyneth Paltrow's really preying on women with sexual dysfunction. And there just seems to be a big industry right now that says, don't get psychiatric help for your trauma, buy this jade egg that you insert into your body. It seems
I don't generally speak to women's issues. We usually have guests on and do that because we do want to respect and honor that. That said, we have done multiple episodes on someone named Kelly Brogan, who specifically has said that depression is a spiritual problem, and if you join her $1,000 membership club, you'll get information to help you combat depression. She has created tapering protocols. She is clinically trained psychiatrist, so I want to be clear on that. So here's a good opportunity for nuance. Pharmaceutical companies create SSRIs and benzodiazepines, and they have a protocol for getting people on them. They've never created one to get people off of them. They don't know. And so that really sucks for people trying to get off them. I've interviewed Robert Whitaker and the team behind Medicating Normal about this issue, and it's a real problem. That said, if you have a now ex-psychiatrist who's trying to sell you their subscription program and their holistic healing course and offers you a tapering protocol, that's just as bad because they don't know either. So yeah, I feel for people who are trying to get off of medications when they feel they should be able to get off of them. But if you're not going to work with a professional and you're instead going to work with someone who's saying it's a spiritual problem and has created their own protocol, that's equally damaging. So to the first part of what you said, there is and it makes sense, right? Conspirituality occurs. I didn't say this earlier. I had said that it works, like we've identified it over 200 years. It usually rises during periods of cultural trauma. So it happened around the time of the Depression. It happened around the time of the 60s, the late 60s. And then this is the latest resurgence of it to the mainstream attention. And one of the things now coming out of the pandemic is that a lot of people are not mentally well. Like, that was really tough. It still is for people who are immunocompromised, right? It's challenging. But you now have yoga teachers who call themselves shamans, who are offering trauma-informed therapy. They're not clinically trained. It's really dangerous. We are doing more work on this in upcoming episodes, Matthew specifically, because he is training to be a therapist at the moment. So, so that is something that I didn't mention in the long list of things that are happening right now, but that is one of them, and that is one of the most egregious in my belief. Thank you.
Good morning, Derek. Thank you for joining us today. I got a digital copy of your book and started reading it last night, so I'm going to recommend it for purchase in our library. During the pandemic, those of us who were online saw a lot of misinformation spread in graphic form or in visual form. And it struck me that one of the things that's missing in a lot of this is basic data literacy. It's very easy to post a picture of something you had on your slide deck, you know, sort of decontextualized images, and it's very easy to put together a graph with a statistic. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role of data literacy or visual literacy in helping to meet our communities where they are, and if that's maybe one way that we can help address this from our end.
That's an interesting, thank you for downloading the book, by the way. That's an interesting, I'm not a visual person as much. My wife over here, she's a UX designer, so she probably would have some more ideas on that specifically, because her job has to do with leading people visually through the right pathways to good information. Interestingly, one thing that I've worked for tech companies, and unfortunately a lot of companies wait too long to think about the user experience. And I think that's important to what you say, because what you're trying to do with these images is lead people to good information or thinking about things in a certain way. I do know that humans are better visual learners than text learners in general. I mean, I've spent my life reading. I prefer text, but even a good visual will still get me. So I have seen some cartoonists who have taken on misinformation on Instagram, for example. So I do know that there are some people who are using such a medium. I don't know of any movement to do that. I've only seen individuals being like, this is my medium, I'm trying to help people to do it. I think it's a great idea. But I don't, there's no sort of codified movement of that at the moment that I'm aware of. But it could exist, I'm just not aware of it. In terms of, while she walks over, in terms of data literacy though, that's everything, right? Like civics and how to read a scientific study or how to read a newspaper article. Like, I think those three things should be pretty fundamental to any child's learning experience and any adult's learning experience. So I would definitely say, like, how to read a data set, I think is pretty important, because the number one spreader of anti-vax misinformation is people taking one sentence from a study, putting it forward as the study, and then I have doctors replying to them being like, they have to spend 10 tweets combating that one sentence to be like, you missed this. No one's paying attention at that point.
Thank you for what you do. I'm Rennie. You're speaking my language about the civics and being able to help our patrons and ourselves be able to decipher what is real out there. And it's very confusing sometimes. We have an asset here in Oregon. Donna Cohen, librarian and teacher, goes around and does programming. And she'll do programming for your patrons too, online or in person. And one of her sessions is misinformation, fake news, and political propaganda. And she teaches you what are the ways to identify when this website is slightly off. Look at the URL and all of these really great tools. She'll be here Friday. She's talking about civics education, but she's got a whole slate of things that she can bring to your libraries. I also wanted to thank you for pointing out that reminding people who they were before is really important. A lot of what happens is being in an in-group, you get really into the social connection aspect that sucks you into a type of group. And if you keep including someone into your group, into your library family, it will keep them a little more grounded.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. One of the things that many of us do when we are collection development providers for our libraries, I've been one for a long time, is we respond to patron requests and what's popular. And so that always, part of our job is to buy books that we don't agree with or understand, which is, why I have to buy textbooks on calculus sometimes. But anyway, I was thinking about the Robert Kennedy Jr. book that came out within the last year, and did I want to buy it? No. Did it have a line of patron request? Yes. We buy what the patrons ask for. We're publicly funded institutions, those of us who work in public libraries or state-funded educational libraries. And so we have to present what people want. So I just would be curious to hear what you'd have to say about that, because it is absolutely something that we do.
There is one of our colleagues, Dan Wilson, who's been on our shows a number of times. He goes under Debunk the Funk on YouTube and all social media. He is a doctor. He is fantastic at debunking information. He took that book to task. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was like, I have over 700 footnotes. Dan went through the footnotes. Many of them were links back to his own blog posts, which had misinformation. And I also want to say that Skyhorse, their publisher, was my old publisher for one of my last books. And I didn't know this when I published with them, but Tony Lyons, the founder, put a YouTube video up years ago saying that I am using all the profits from Skyhorse to fund anti-vax initiatives. We covered it on the podcast. He has since taken that video down, but I have it saved, because I think it's very important to know from that publisher specifically. And I don't know, that seems like a real bind. Like, I can see, there was one point in the talk where I was talking about the podcast in Oregon, and I had lost my train of thought briefly, and I wrapped it back, but I didn't make the point I wanted to make, which was, in the research for this podcast I'm doing about the history of the state of Oregon, I bought a book, and I was flipping through the table of contents, and there was a whole section on anti-vaccination movement. I was like, cool, I would really like to know the history of that. What I didn't know when I bought it was written by an anti-vaccinationist. And he is profoundly, he's writing a book right now. This book's 20 years old. He's writing one right now about the anti-vax movement. But he's coming at it from a political theory aspect. And I'm like, wow, I don't know as much about that. So I'm going to read this book. So I think it's really healthy to read from people you don't agree with. But if they're purposefully spreading misinformation, that's a little tough for me, because if it could be if it could be traced back to things that we know that can be provably untrue, I wouldn't want that job. I think it's a really hard situation. And now that he's running for president, and he's taken a pretty unique religious angle on the way that he's running in the last day, actually, I can see you'd want to, would I want to read a book that someone ghost wrote for Donald Trump? No. But I would understand why someone would stock it, because people would be interested in that. So, yeah, and in a sense, that does fall back on your role of being when people ask for it, be like, I don't know what sort of relationships or communications happen. I know growing up in my hometown public library, I would talk to my librarian there. I know there's different roles here, but I would talk about, the content of books. And so there might be some room there to have conversations about content. That's the best I could foresee.
This will be our last question.
No pressure. So I was really interested in what you were talking about with healthcare and the idea of healthy skepticism versus this, conspiracy type thing. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions of how to communicate with medical professionals without being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, like to be able to say, like, I really don't feel like I need this surgery. What other avenues can I pursue without being like, I don't want you cutting into me kind of feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it kind of goes to the end of my talk. That's a one-on-one situation because some doctors are amazing and some aren't, don't have good bedside manner. So I'll give a brief example. I went through 2 surgeries within 11 months. I had testicular cancer. I went through the surgery to remove the tumor and then chemotherapy. And every part of that process with my oncologist was amazing, including the fact that she has prescribed painkillers, and I'm not against them when you need them, but I'd rather not take them because I know how addictive they are. And I told her that. I said, look, you might not be able to say this, but I just took cannabis and I felt fine. I wouldn't want to take, you gave me 120 pills. That's kind of crazy. Right, you gave me 130 pills, and you gave me 3 refills that I didn't have to see you with, and I was like, and she was very open to that, and that was great. And then I had a meniscus surgery, and then as I'm in with the orthopedic surgeon, he's like, he got my X-rays, he looked at everything, it's a pretty bad tear. He's like, what do you do? And he's like, well, I'm a yoga instructor, and he laughed, and he's like, I'll just put personal trainer, and then going into the surgery, they were going to do 3 holes. When I opened up my bandaging, when I got home a day later, there were 4. So I'm kind of like, wait, why are there extra holes in my body that I didn't know about? And I didn't find out for a week until I went back. And so I'm just using that as an example of within the same UCLA medical system that I was at the time, I had an amazing experience where I could talk openly with the doctor. She wanted to do 2 rounds of preventive chemo. It didn't metastasize. I didn't need chemo. I did a round because I wanted to be proactive. She wanted 2. I had a friend who did 12. 1 was tough. It's tough. So people who go through that, I was just and I said to her, I said, look, I read the literature, I showed BMJ, literature, and this gives me less than a 1% chance of it returning if I get the second round, and it's already at 98%. I'd rather not do the second round. And she said, fine, I understand that. I'm totally fine with that. So unfortunately, it's just gonna, that was cases where I was comfortable talking to the doctor and they were open to it, but it's gonna be up to the doctor. Last thing I'll say, my experiences, the one gift that I feel like this podcast has brought me is that I have access to so many medical professionals now that are willing to come on and talk to us, and they have just been amazing. And they fill in so many holes in my knowledge, and I think in listeners' knowledge, that is really relevant. And I think that's one of the best aspects of this project so far. So I would just advise to look for, a lot of them have podcasts, and there are a lot of great resources out there right now with medical professionals being like, hey, our profession is taking a hit. We have to get ahead of this too. And they've stepped up since the pandemic began. So I'll be walking around. I'll be at the conference. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.